All right, Jack, so you've graduated from law school. You're starting your first job. Now, this is the Gainesville Legal Aid Office? Okay. You earlier said this was traumatic, I think may have been the word you used. Tell us why. What happened?
Well, a couple of things. One, there's a tradition in the South, it's not honored anymore, I don't think, but if you're a lawyer, you're referred to as colonel.
Okay.
And so I go up to Gainesville. It's probably still in parts of North Georgia, it's still like that. But I went up to Gainesville, and suddenly these people who are older and wiser than I am are referring to me as colonel and asking for my advice on things. I thought, why are you asking me?
And besides, I'm only a captain.
Yeah. So there's that. There's a sudden sense of, I have this power and authority and respect just from having gone to law school.
That surprised you?
That really, I was taken aback by it. But the other was I didn't know what I was doing. There was very little that I knew what to do. If if the practice of law involved being called upon in class, I could have done it really well. But it didn't. Yeah. So just something as simple as figuring out a calendar, showing up for calendar call and knowing exactly what to do, and when do you need the clients or witnesses there, and when you don't need them there, that seemed, that entire world was a mystery to me. So I always was nervous about it, anxious about everything that I was doing. I had a couple of, Ernie Harris was the managing attorney. Ernie is a bankruptcy lawyer over in Athens. Ernie was helpful. And then the other person who had been in the office for a while was Mary Margaret Oliver, who later was, she's still in the House of Representatives. She was a senator and she ran for lieutenant governor. And she and I remain very, very dear friends. She also was a Druid Hills graduate, but she was younger. And they were helpful, but they had their own caseloads, and we had enormous caseloads back then. I just knew I didn't know what I was doing. It made me feel very uncomfortable. And so, as you and I were talking during the break, I took my usual approach and started reading everything I possibly could on the subject, which, and still wasn't getting very far.
And when you say the subject, at that point, what do you?
Practice.
Okay.
I had two good successes during that time. There's an amusing story about one of them. The Gainesville Hospital was Hill Burton Hospital. Hill Burton Hospital is supposed to use a certain percentage of their, allocate a certain percentage of their revenues to service to the poor. Free service to the poor, okay? You get the federal money, you're going to allocate so many services to the poor. Well, what Gainesville Hospital was doing, and what many hospitals were doing, is not that. They would attempt to collect, and if they couldn't collect, they then write it off as Hill Burton. Well, that was, to my way of thinking, a clear violation of the regulations. And so I filed a suit against the hospital. While the suit was pending, I had to have some minor surgery. It was just not a big deal. They were just curious about something that was going on. And so I went to the Gainesville Hospital. As I'm coming out from under the anesthesia, I'm looking up and there are all these nurses surrounding me and laughing. And said, what happened? I said, well, we just wanted you to know that we think you're right about that lawsuit. I said, what? I said, yeah, as you were telling us all about.
While you were under.
While I was under. So much for work product and confidentiality and everything else. But they caved and they gave in. Oh, there were a couple of others actually. The one I was thinking of is Wilma Nix, this young 19-year-old mother who she had had a very, very rough time, bounced from foster home to foster home, and she's going in the hospital to have her child. Her child was born, DFAC shows up, takes the child. DFACs did it on the argument that Wilma was not in a situation, it was, I guess you'd say, prospective deprivation.
Mm-hmm.
She's not in a situation where she can care for the child. If the child is with her, the child will be deprived. Well, I said, no, you can't. It's not a question of will be. You must find a child in a deprived status, and you can't do it based on what you know about Wilma. Not a question of having the right character under your criteria for having children. So it took a very long time, but that one went from the juvenile court where we lost to the Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals bounced it up to the Supreme Court, and we eventually won. And then there was a 1983 involving, it's a typical 1983. It was a prisoner who was being denied access to law books, and that one was an easy win. Mm-hmm. The only thing interesting about that one is that the guy on the other side from me was at that time the chairman of the board of Georgia Legal Services. So we
Interesting.
Yeah, we had a conflict, but the judge essentially waived it and said,
Well, other than trying to read about practice, how did you get through it? I mean, you said before there wasn't a great deal of mentoring
well, I
going
wasn't
on.
getting through it very well, I didn't think. If it was an appeal or an administrative matter like most of those were, like the hospital was, yeah, I could do it. But the trial stuff, we were doing, Georgia Legal Services was doing domestic cases at the time. And there were others. There were some consumer cases. I represented a housing authority down in Winder, Georgia, and a bunch of other things. I just did not know what I was doing. So I stumbled through it, is the answer. There really, I mean, I would ask everybody I could find. I didn't really, this was a mistake on my part, I didn't go outside of the legal services community looking for help, which I should have. But we were kind of a closed group at that time. There were a couple of judges, very good judges, who were helpful. But no, I stumbled through it, and I kept thinking about, it's really where the question that I then pursued for the rest of my life, the question about what does it mean to be a good lawyer and how you become one and so forth, that I started thinking about then. And it's really why I applied for the fellowship at Antioch, because I didn't know what I was doing and thought law school had and somehow failed me, throw me out there like that.
Right. And then
Usual story. Really.
Sure, but but then to try to become the good lawyer, whatever that turns out to mean, by doing it and by making mistakes, what I assume was part of it, that doesn't seem ideal.
No, it doesn't. Not when the
People could be harmed.
people could be harmed along the way. And there were people being harmed. I became something of I don't think this harmed people, but it was something that gave me pause. And I did an awful lot of truth in lending litigation, became known as the local authority in truth in lending. And back then, it's not the case anymore, but back then you could file a truth in lending counterclaim to any loan collection. And the truth in lending counterclaim had a statutory amount that if there was a violation there, and usually we were dealing with such small loans that the statutory amount would be as much, if not more than the loan, or at least reduce the loan down to where it just wasn't worth it to pursue it. Well, this is going to sound like I'm tooting my own horn, but I mean it more as a problem with the legislation than anything. There was not a loan contract that I couldn't find a truth in lending violation. I made it a point that there wouldn't be. So I always find a decent truth in lending argument, not just one that was made up in order to get by ethical concerns, but one that had a reasonable chance of success. And so I had this flood of people coming in owing small amounts on debts and just filing these things one after another. And these loan companies started calling me up, and one loan company guy calls me up and says, "How can you live with yourself at doing this?" And it didn't even occur to me that there was a problem here. These are poor people. They didn't have the money. You shouldn't have lent it to them to begin with. And so my immediate response was, how can you live with yourself? How can you do this? But then I thought, wait a minute, these folks rely upon these loans. Exorbitant interest rates, yes, but some of these were people, they weren't excessive, at least not under what was called the Industrial Loan Act at the time and so forth. They were doing everything the law permitted. I was just finding what people tend to call a technicality. And so I thought about that a great deal. And that too was one of the reasons why I wanted to get away from this for a while and think about it. Mm-hmm. And it occurred to me that one of the best ways of doing that was this fellowship. I'd be teaching, mm-hmm. and as you know, there's nothing better for your own learning than trying to teach someone else.
Well, if you're in the midst of doing all of this and you're wondering about or even troubled by some of what's happening, there's no time to reflect.
No, the caseload wouldn't permit it. And yeah.
I want to talk.
I do remember Mary Margaret telling me once, because I was representing these clients in interesting ways, we'll say, and she calls me into her office. She's younger than I am, but if you've ever met Mary Margaret, she can be an intimidating soul.
Yes.
Calls me into her office, and she says, "Jack, I have one thing to say to you, because she saw me as crusading, and so your clients need one thing. It's money." And she said, "You can leave now."
They don't need a cause; they need money. Yeah. Before I ask you about, we can talk about Antioch. This is obviously a difficult time for you as you're trying to do all these things.
Well, it's fun, Antioch.
But before we get to Antioch,
Okay.
But that's my question. What was fun about that?
The camaraderie.
Okay.
The camaraderie in the office was great fun. Yeah.
Was that because it was you
Yes.
all against the world? Or?
Yes, that's a large part of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So very like-minded.
We'd have these office meetings. We'd set out the agenda for how we're going to change the world.
How'd that work out for you?
Not so well. But we'd set priorities about what are the greatest needs in Gainesville and so forth and so on, decide that'd be our priority. And of course, mm-hmm. your priority is dictated by who happens to walk in the door at the time. Right. We could fudge a bit on that, but yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think people realize as much as they should how much the joy of practicing law is the camaraderie mm-hmm. of the people you're working with. Yeah. Well, let's talk about Antioch.
Okay.
The opportunity came to you. I'm not sure how, but let's talk about how did this come about, and then talk a little bit about what you did there.
I think it might have been the Journal of Higher Legal Education or something like that I saw this notice for clinical fellowships at Antioch. Now, Antioch, let me, for the people not familiar with it.
That includes me, so...
okay, so there's nothing like Antioch in the world right now. That Antioch was started by Jean and Edgar Kahn, interracial couple that were at GW. Mm-hmm. And they were in charge of all of the clinical courses. That was mostly Jean, and Edgar was doing that, but he was also involved in classroom teaching. Edgar's father had been a rather famous law professor, and Edmund Kahn, written some impressive books. They decided to start their own law school, and it was going to be an all-clinical law school. And Edgar and Jean had the connections to make that possible. Some of them were Chicago connection, Sawyer. Mm-hmm. Sawyer Mishnikov and some of her proteges. Now there's a character. Did you have her?
I did not.
Yeah. Probably the most intimidating woman I've ever met. And I've met some intimidating women.
I've heard that about her.
Yeah. So they went to the ABA and they said, we're going to start an all-clinical law school. We will not be able to go through the normal accreditation process, but we need accreditation. We can't go through the normal accreditation process because it's going to take too long. We won't be able to stay afloat. We're going to affiliate with another school to get some initial help, but there's no school in the country that's going to be willing to keep us afloat while we wait for accreditation. The ABA was very sympathetic. They wanted, this was back when the Ford Foundation and other foundations were pushing schools in the direction, by giving money in the direction of clinic. It was really the beginning of the clinics. The ABA very much wanted the school to set the model for a clinical law school.
So we're mid-70s, roughly, yeah.
And gave them an assurance that there would be a quick turnaround, that there would be a provisional accreditation, that if it was going reasonably well, that they'd get accredited. Now, this is all kind of backdoor. They're not supposed to be saying things like that. But right. They were going to violate their own rules in order to get this thing done, treat it as an exception experiment, and there are other ways of thinking about it than normal accreditation. So they set up this school. They pitched the idea to a bunch of schools. The two that were most interested in it were Duke and Antioch. They went with Antioch, which was probably a mistake. Antioch offered them the best terms. And Antioch was going to allow them to be pretty much a free-floating law school. Duke was mostly interested in having a chapter. I don't know if you call it a chapter, not a chapter. Having a part of their clinical offering in D.C. So Duke was thinking of it not as a freestanding law school with the university connection, but as part of Duke Law School.
Or a satellite.
Yeah, satellite office, yeah. And they went with Antioch. Well, Duke has resources that Antioch would never be able to reach, and Antioch at the time was killing itself by spreading itself out throughout the world. Antioch campuses showing up everywhere. Antioch was a small little school in Yellow Springs, Ohio, and suddenly there are Antiochs everywhere. But they went with Antioch, and Antioch helped them financially, allowed them to hold on to all of their revenues and so forth, and they set up this all-clinical law school, which meant that students started practicing law from the day they got there, under supervision, obviously. But they were assigned to particular clinics, and they rotated through clinics. There were professional methods courses that they were taking at the same time. But they had clients, they were doing interviews, you name it, from the minute they got there. This attracted a particular kind of student. They were, I don't want to say radical because they were going to be lawyers, and it's hard to be radical and be a lawyer. But they were public service, politically involved, interesting characters, some difficult, talented people in other ways. Wonderful collection of students. Great diversity, enormous diversity. And they set this up. Okay, so I applied for the fellowship. We go up there and interviewed by Terry. He was under Sawyer at Chicago, then went to the University of Miami, wrote an evidence book. Is it coming to you?
No.
Terry. It'll come to me as soon as we finish. It's always how it is.
Right.
So I interviewed by Terry and got the fellowship. The fellowship was absolutely delightful. They set it up to be a tax-free fellowship. Gene and Edgar knew how to play all those kind of games. So I ended up making more money I was making in Georgia, quite a lot, more than I was making in Georgia. And I went up there and was placed in charge of the consumer law clinic because of the truth in lending stuff that I had been doing. Started teaching a professional methods course with Rusty Von Keller, Arthur Von Keller IV. I don't know if that's a name. He ended up being well known in legal services and quite a character, as his name would suggest. He lived up to his name, Arthur Von Keller IV. He was a bit of a Prussian general.
Okay.
And so it was a delightful time. There were about 12 of us, clinical fellows. We were pretty much indistinguishable from faculty. Gene and Edgar, it was a 2-year fellowship. Gene and Edgar, about a year and a half in, maybe a little less than that, came to me and asked me if I would take on a project. There was a guy there by the name of Russ Court, who was not a lawyer. He was a specialist in education, I think you'd say. Very, very smart man. And through conversations with Russ, they had come up with this idea about competency-based education, which was then spreading around. It was in its infancy. It became well known later on in a whole bunch of different fields and quite controversial, still is and should be. But they wanted to apply those principles to legal education. And so they asked me if I would join with Russ and that we could take that on as a project. And so about the last quarter of the fellowship, I was doing that, and then they extended me for another year. And then I was just a research fellow. And the idea with competency-based education is this: starts from a simple problem. How do you evaluate students in the clinic? And how do you measure progressions within the clinic? Other than I know it when I see it,
Right.
How do you do that? What we started doing was analyzing lawyering task for what competencies are involved in that task. Now, competencies include everything:
Sure.
skills, attitudes, knowledge, you name it. And we could divide it up into competencies. We came up with this huge list organized around major competencies and sub-competencies and sub-sub-competencies and so forth and so on. And with that, you could look at a student who's doing something like an interview, use what we were doing to diagnose that, and then compare that with the same student's performance at a trial, at a hearing, at doing a deposition, you name it. And see, that would confirm your diagnosis from over here is where the problem areas were, but you could also see progress that way.
Just what some people would call a rubric?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's a rubric that would fit multiple lawyering situations.
It was designed to fit all.
Okay.
All lawyering tasks. That's how we pitched it. Could be diagnosed in terms of this. Now, the evaluation, if you want to reduce this to a grade, you have to find something outside of it. And the one that we came up with was a degree of supervision required for competent performance, which is subjective as all grading is.
Sure.
But over time could become more objective as people use this. In fact, what we were doing is kind of providing a language for clinics, a grading language that clinics could use. We wrote that up as an article, first for Cleveland State, and then wrote it up again when Antioch had its own journal. The article was picked up by the ABA, and it was published serially in an ABA newsletter that was going out. And then it was picked up, gosh, I think it was Argentina, maybe Germany, anyhow, several countries that picked it up as well. We did presentations at AALS, and then we did a little dog and pony show. We would take it around to schools that were interested in it. We came up with a manual as to how to use it in addition to the article, and it kind of took off. And there were schools that started buying into this. And some of those schools said, well, wait a minute, if this makes sense for the clinic, it actually makes sense for all of legal education. We should have, we could use this in curriculum design. Because is there anything that's left out here of what you want as an end product? And we thought at the time, no. So that was going well. I brought that with me to Mercer when I was hired out of Antioch to be director of clinical education, and Mercer then became, the first 3 years, kind of a testing ground to see how this thing was working, and I'd be reporting to all these people as to how the evaluation was working. I had a falling out with myself over that. I don't think it's the right way to do it.
Okay. Well, that's one of the benefits of being a scholar. You can disagree with yourself later on.
Vehemently.
First of all, whatever happened to Antioch?
It still continues in the form of DC Law School. Antioch itself had financial trouble. It could no longer do anything for the school and started demanding things for the school, which the school couldn't do. Clinical education is extremely expensive.
Right, and that's really what I meant was what happened to the all clinical model.
It was, for the most part, abandoned. There are some things about that model that continue in DC Law School, but not in the way it was, not even close to the way it was. That's more like medical education than it is like legal education. Sure. And unless you've got the resources medical education has, you're just not going to be able to do it.
This was your first experience as a teacher.
Yeah, loved it.
I was going to say, tell me about that, because something clicked again.
Oh yeah. Well, it combined the best of both worlds. I'm constantly thinking about things that interest me about the practice of the law and putting those into effect. And the students there were so interesting. They were such a diverse group. And Antioch was such an interesting place. Let me give you one example of that. There was a time when some threats had been made against the law school, in part because of the law school, through Terry, whose name is still going to come to me, had been involved in some landlord-tenant cases in D.C. and had been very successful. And the landlords around the city were not at all happy with what had happened. So some threats had been made against the law school. There were other situations where the clinics were doing things that were not too popular with moneyed interest and the like. So once the threats were made, what did Gene and Edgar do? They hired the Black Panthers to provide security at the law school. So I come into the law school one day, and there's a guy with a beret and everything else, and the chains standing at the door asking me who I was. I said, wait a minute, who are you? I said, well, Black Panthers are now providing security to your school.
Interesting times.
Suffice to say that no one messed with us.
That's not surprising. I've heard you say before that this was a time when you first began to think deeply and systematically about what it meant to be a good lawyer, and that, of course, in many ways has been a focus, not your only one, but a focus for the rest of your career.
Well, yes, and a lot of that was prompted by Russ Court and work on that, but it was also prompted by arguments with Russ Court. Russ had a very, very analytical mind. I thought there were problems with it as we were going along. Hard for me to address them because we were being so successful and people were praising this and a breakthrough and so forth. There's still people when I go to ALS that the way they know me is through that early work.
With which you disagree.
With which I disagree, and I put it in print at one time that why
So the development of the competency-based model or the rubric, that this is a first attempt to say this is what it means to be a good lawyer.
And then a lot of the thinking was prompted by my own reaction to that, because there were things missing from that were not going to be captured in the rubric. It's back to the sort of thing that you and I have talked about at great length, is that it's less what you can do, it's more who are you. And I really thought that was being left out. Yeah. Ethics became something on a checklist on the rubric. And it didn't occur to me that that was a serious problem until, actually I think it was a member of the Board of Visitors of the law school. One was doing something, came down to the clinic, found out what we were doing, and he was the one that said, that's not right. And I tried defending it, realized that I really couldn't. And so I started thinking a great deal about that, and that then led me, in many ways, to Tom Schaefer, who became a mentor. Tom had been the dean at Notre Dame, as you know, and was a law professor there, but also involved in their clinic, and had written about interviewing and counseling and many, many other articles about the practice of law, and he was writing from a Catholic perspective, which he was upfront about. No one else in the legal literature was being upfront about religious belief in any of their writing, as far as I knew. So Tom was kind of an aha moment.
Well, if ethics is one item on the checklist and there are 10 items and you get 9 out of 10 but don't get the ethics, that's really not quite good lawyer. That's a problem.
Yes, and it misses out on how central ethics is to all of the rest.
Right. And so your checklist maybe in some ways should have said have the right kind of character.
Right.
And that's the entire.
Yeah. And you don't want virtues to become a checklist either.
Yeah.
Yeah. Virtues is a much better way of doing it. But it too is about becoming a person, and that's not a checklist thing. So.
Right, and we're jumping way ahead.
Oh, got that honesty.
But one of the risks of teaching the way I teach it, listing the virtues, is it almost looks like a checklist.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not the way it should be thought of.
Yeah, it may be necessary in order to get kids to understand it.
It's a start.
There are other problems with the competency-based approach. Those are written up in the literature, but not so much the legal literature as other education that have pointed out those problems, that in some ways you end up teaching to test, even though the tests are not the handwritten exercises answering questions. And the teaching is, as you know, a much more mysterious thing than that. That often what it is that you end up teaching when teaching is at its best emerges from the teaching that you're doing. Right. Rather than saying, I want the students to be able to spell these words at the end. It's really, I want the students to be able to spell, and that's different. Yeah.
Tell me about the transition to Mercer. How did it come about that from Antioch you came here to Macon? Came back to Macon.
Yeah, I did. And okay, so Gene and Edgar were if I stayed on, they promised they would place me. They said, so I don't have a job, but so they promised they would place me. But that placing in legal education is very hard to do. I've tried it with a few friends with contacts and the like, and I've never been successful. So they made some contacts with me and got my foot in the door and things like that. But I went through the ALS, and I got calls from 3 schools. One of them was an undergraduate school, which was interesting to me. That wanted me to do pre-law courses and to head up their pre-law program and so forth. And then the other two were just typical clinic placements. And so Mercer called, and I thought this was fate, that going back to Macon, Macon had been considered by the family home. We'd lived all over, but Macon was home. And I jumped at it. Blaney was less enthusiastic and remains less enthusiastic. But I jumped at it. Bruce Jacob, whom you know well, was the dean. Oh, he's coming in as dean. The initial contact was with John Cole. And
As interim dean.
the interim dean, yeah. And he actually became associate dean. Bruce came dean during the process. So it was right at the transition. So
It's
it was
a
with
strange
John Cole.
serendipity because the first dean that ever hired me was Bruce Jacob.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, let me tell you what Bruce did to me.
Okay.
I love Bruce, as I know you do.
I love Bruce too. Bruce, if you're listening, we both love you. But,
And Ann.
yeah, of course.
Yeah. One of the nicest men I've ever met.
Absolutely.
So anyhow, John calls, and I come down, go through the interview, and we have dinner at the Green Jacket, I think it was, and Kurt Strasser, Larry Ripstein, Joe Claxton, a few others, and we go through all the interviews, and I eventually get the call. Let me back up a second. At the meeting where I was to be hired, the person who spoke out against me the most, only person who spoke out against me, was Larry Ripstein. Said, "This is a terrible mistake, you should never do it." Well, fortunately for me, no one ever listened to Larry. Now, later on, the world listened to Larry.
Yeah, I understand.
He became extremely influential in partnership law and corporate law, and constantly on call from... His blog was, while he was alive, was, I don't know whether you'd say, I guess most subscribed law professor blog. Well, the irony there is that when I got to Mercer, Larry and I became very, very dear friends. And I still miss him terribly. I still think about him constantly. We had horrible arguments. But you know how you love people you argue with? You form this kind of relationship with them, and you get past the argument, and you love them because of the argument in some ways. So we had a friendship of argument. We disagreed on almost everything, including movies, which we talked about quite a lot. He was very good on film. So the irony was that Larry and I became best friends, really, and did all our running together and partied together and dinners together and everything else. So I come down, I get the call from John, who offers me the position. I was going to be under Forrest Mauston, who was the director of the clinic at the time, and I was going to be really the first hire after Forrest into the clinic. And pretty much the freedom to set that clinic up, whatever mine was, in the way I wanted to. All right, so I accepted the terms and everything else. I then, I guess a month later, get a call from Bruce and introduce himself, and he says, "We've got a problem." And I said, "What?" He said, "We didn't get the money for your position."
Oh, that.
Yeah.
Whoops.
And I said, "What?" He said, "I've already accepted." And he said, "No." He said, "Well, let me tell you what I've done. I've worked it out with the university where we can fund half of your position. And can you take it under those terms as maybe a 1, maybe a 2-year deal, and then we'd be able to fund it. Can you fund yourself?" This is back when funding yourself in clinical education, not that hard to do. I knew how to do grants and had done them before and helped with grants at Antioch. So I thought, clever money, Ford money,
Sure.
find it. I've got a bit of a name here because of this competency-based stuff. So I could probably get help with that. I'd already done some grant reviews for Clapper, and so I knew who the people were. I thought, oh, okay, I can do that. And then about a month after that, Bruce calls back again, said, and I wasn't eager to have this phone call come in, but it was good news, I guess. He said, Jack, forget what I said last time. Forrest Mauston has left. So this was about a week before it's supposed to show up. Forrest Mauston's left. You will be the director of clinical education. And I've got one position then that you'll be able to fill. So we came down, got started. It was the most demanding job I've ever had those first 5 years. I would work from 7 in the morning to 7 or 8 at night every single day and still not feel like I had done enough. And then at 7 or 8, I'd start reading law review articles. I mean, I was just obsessed with this. Never had I had more work.
Describe the work.
Well, we were setting up the clinic. I was teaching huge loads to small groups in order to get enough students into the clinic. In addition to that, we had the caseload that I was supervising. And I had set it up, actually Forrest had done part of this. There was going to be a prosecutor's clinic, there was going to be a defense clinic. We also had a civil clinic. We later had a Social Security clinic, Social Security Disability clinic. Well, it was all mine at the time. When I got here, I got money. I think that money was from the Ford Foundation. Actually, for about 4 years, I got money and I hired people. I'd start taking over bits and pieces. And the first person we hired was Darrell Dantzler. And the trial practice program was essentially mine. There were adjuncts who were doing it, but Bruce wanted me to bring it into the school and make it a faculty program, which I was trying to do. And it really brought Darrell in to do that, but also she was going to do the defense clinic.
Talk to me for a minute about the status of clinic teachers, and you in particular, at that time, because over the years there have been classifications of clinic teachers separately from sort of so-called doctrinal faculty and so on. What was the status of that at that time?
Well, there was a division, but in the beginning I was the only one. And all my friends were all, typical classroom law faculty teachers. So it wasn't much of a division. I think they were a little bit threatened by clinic. Students flocked to the clinic. We had to turn students down. The students who were in the clinic loved it. Students, this wasn't my doing, but students would tend to say to other students, all that classroom stuff's a waste of time.
You didn't say that.
I
They did.
never, and I didn't believe it either.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew. I was shocked at how little they could do. Even the things that you expected them to be able to do coming out of the classroom. So there was a bit of that shock. But I think for many of the faculty, they were trying to piece together their relationship. They were more worried about me than I was about them in some ways. They're trying to piece together their relationship with the practice of law. And especially John Cole, interestingly. But others too. So when I started hiring people, a couple of the people that I hired weren't good fits. They were good fits for the clinic. They weren't good fits for this law school or for the faculty. And there was tension there.
Now, these people be hired as faculty?
They were hired as clinical faculty.
Okay.
But there wasn't a clear division. There wasn't anything in the rules about this.
Okay.
So they were just told they were clinical faculty. I had made it clear to all of them as they're coming in that their responsibility includes writing, research and writing. That didn't work with Darrell. She thought law review articles was didn't justify the tree that was cut down for the paper. And I'm sure still thinks that way.
I was going to say that she hadn't changed her mind.
Yeah, although she's written a bit. But there wasn't much in the way of tension, and other than two of the people I hired, they were a married couple, and that was a mistake. He was hired tenure track. She was hired as staff attorney. he wanted to move her to tenure track. The faculty said no, and he left. Right after he left, I was asked by Carl Warden, who was the dean at the time, to move into the associate dean out of the clinic. I said, when he came down to ask me, I said, Carl, I think this is a mistake. For one, do you think that this faculty is ready to have a clinician as their associate dean? And for the other, who's going to take my place? And Carl said, Jack, those are your problems, not mine.
Thank you very much.
And I said, oh, yeah. And I could not say to Carl anything other than the word yes to Carl. It didn't matter what he ever asked. No, there were a couple of things. Once I was associate dean, I had to say no to.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ed.
Oh, Pat, I wish you had gotten to know Carl Warden and to do one of these with him. He's the most interesting man I've ever met.
I have heard that, and I'm sorry we didn't get the chance.
Let me tell you one story at the end of his life. We'll jump from there to the end of his life. He left the deanship. And after leaving the deanship, he wrote, he pursued his hobby of model trains with some renown, frequently on the cover of the Model Railroad. And he wrote detective novels and did a bunch of stuff. But he had bad lungs, and they were getting worse. He was in the hospital, and the doctor said, you've got to be intubated. And he said, no, you're not going to do that. I'm not going to do it. They said, well, you'll be dead in a few days. He said, okay. So he gathers the family around. I find out about this, and I go over to see him. He's lying lying on the bed, and there are all the family around. And he's weak, but he could talk. It didn't really look like he was in pain. He'd just wear out because he couldn't get oxygen. And I'm talking with him, and I said, Carl, listen, we got to get you out of here because things are not going so well at the law school right now, and we need you back as dean. And he looked up at me and said, Jack, are you trying to kill me? And everybody laughed.
Yeah.
And then as I was leaving him, he had a book signing coming up. And it was out at Barnes & Noble. And everybody knew he wasn't going to make it, but we're leaving. I said, well, Carl, I'll see you at the book signing. And he said, I'll be there one way or another. Yeah.
Well, you've got 5 years running the clinics before you moved to associate dean?
I think that's right.
Okay.
I think it's 5. And then two and a half as associate dean, and then I was, believe it or not, I was associate vice president of finance at the university for about a year. That was in addition to being a regular law professor and teaching my courses.
In a sense, I want to skip forward, but in context, I think it makes sense. You've got 5 years running a successful, thriving clinical education experience. It's safe to say, although we do have some clinic work going on now at the law school, that it's not what it was.
What happened? Yeah.
What happened to it?
Oh, it was not only successful. This is not me. This is the support that we got eventually from the school and the faculty getting over their initial concerns and the people who were doing the work and people were looking at Mercer as a model. We really had a wonderful reputation. And I was going to these clinical education conferences around the country, and they all knew about Mercer. And so what happened? Well, after I left, we hired some people in. The director did fine, but he had some problems. And so there was that. But what really happened was the Woodruff.
And we're going to have a chance to talk in detail about the Woodruff curriculum, but
I'll tell you how it affected it.
Yeah,
and it's my fault. Dick and Hal and I were asked to spend a summer doing nothing but the Woodruff planning, and the question was, what about the clinic? How is this going to fit into the Woodruff plan? And
So it
what
was
is
still
the Woodruff
thriving
plan?
at that point?
Yeah. I mean, not what it had been, but it was still doing reasonably well. We were no longer getting outside funding. That had dried up, and so it was fairly expensive. Well, I kind of cut a deal with, I don't know if they'd describe it this way, but I would, with Dick and Hal. And look, we all agree that clinics can provide what you and I were calling earlier these moments of coherence. That
The formative experiences,
yes.
yeah.
And that's crucial. They didn't have any problem with that. But if that's right, then that should be available to everyone in some fashion. It just doesn't make sense to say you learn the practice of, you prepare for the practice of law best by going through a clinic and then have it set up so that only 10% of the students can do that. It's really not fair to the rest. So drop the clinic. Instead of the clinic, let's take the resources that would have been used for the clinic, plow it into skills courses and simulation courses and advanced courses, advanced simulation courses in the third year that will give to students, all students, the opportunity to have those moments. Give to them an opportunity to understand what it feels like to be a lawyer. And the responsibility of doing that, it'll shift their attitude towards learning around. They agreed with that, and that's what we were trying to do.
So it's a much more conscious decision to shift away from it.
It was very
then.
much a conscious decision.
Yeah.
Was it a mistake? Not during the early years of the Woodruff. As people began to chip away at the Woodruff, and as Hal and Dick and I and others didn't do the job that we should have done in educating new faculty and other faculty as to what we were trying to accomplish, over time, especially in the last 5 years or so, it looks like a mistake. The clinic that we have now, and Sarah is remarkable and deserves all of the accolades that have come her way. And for her students, it's the most meaningful experience of their academic careers, without a doubt. So for Sarah and the work that she's doing, it's wonderful. But that's a very, very limited number of people.
Well, that did a little bit ahead of the story there, but I did want to know, frankly, because I didn't know, and have never known how that happened. What I'd like to do is let's take a break and let's pick up the story where we were, and in this next part, one of the things I certainly want to talk about is the Woodruff gift, how that was handled, and some more detail about the development of the Woodruff curriculum, and that'd be a good thing to talk about
Sounds
next.
good.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.